Welcome back to Eat Sleep Boxing Repeats YouTube channel. I'd like to be joined for another fantasy fights video by Greg. Greg, thank you for joining me. Really looking forward to this one. How's things with you?
Thanks very much for having me, Elliot. I'm really looking forward to this one. Love talking these fantasy fights, so let's get to it, mate, and see what's happening.
Yeah, we were just saying off camera, like, it's great. It's a great thing to discuss. There's a bit of frustration there, knowing that obviously these fights are never going to happen. We're never going to know what would have happened. And really enjoyed talking about fantasy fights for Tyson Fury, Amir Khan. Today we're going to be talking about Andre Ward, who's a fighter who I've personally always enjoyed watching. Maybe not the most exciting fighter, but look, retired undefeated, as we know, beat Sergey Kovalev when Kovalev was arguably at the top of his game at 175. Beat Carl Froch, beat Mikhail Kessler, beat some other good fighters as well. And for me, doesn't get spoken about enough. I think he was a top fighter. Won was it a gold medal at the 2004 Olympics? I think it was.
Yes. Yeah. And he also did lose from the age of 9 years old.
Something like that. So crazy. And like, I always thought like one thing about Andre Ward wasn't the most exciting, but a question I want to ask you later is, how do you beat this guy? Like, because it looked impossible at times. To start off with, like in a nutshell, you know more about boxing technically than I do. You boxed yourself. How would you describe Andre Ward as a fighter to someone who's a casual fan or to someone who hadn't seen Andre Ward fight? In a nutshell, how would you describe him?
An all-time great. Tremendous footwork, tremendous brain. What you look at these guys like Andre Ward, Mayweather, it's their brain, Elliot. They think their way through fights, but they do it effortlessly. And his feet work was tremendous as well. He knew how to be in and out of range, not get involved with these guys. I think we've seen him massively hurt once in his career, Kovalev maybe. Aside from that, just mate, an all-time great. That's the best way I could put it.
Yeah, I just thought, I understand he wasn't everyone's cup of tea. I know he was awkward, but with me, I just looked at him and thought, like, you almost wanted to find someone who could beat him, because there were so many fighters who he fought, who he just kind of schooled and made look a bit silly. And I remember when Carl Froch fought him, and I kind of thought, you know, Carl Froch is going to win. He's got a good chance. And then 3 rounds in, you're like, yeah, Carl Froch isn't going to win this one. But yeah, it is what it is. So we've got 3 fighters to cover. We're going to be talking about what would have happened if Andre Ward had fought 3 separate fighters. Peak versus peak. I know Andre Ward spent most of his career at super middleweight, a bit at light heavyweight. We're going to focus on super middleweight just because that's when I think he was at his peak personally. The first fighter we're going to be talking about, and it's a really interesting one. To discuss. Joe Calzaghe. Would have been undefeated against undefeated, would have been, I think, 32-0 against 46-0, I believe. I know it's a really tricky one to predict. We're going to get onto that a little bit later, but just talk to me about what you think could have happened in this fight in terms of how the styles would have clashed, how each fighter would have approached it. What are your immediate thoughts?
Yeah, well, we might as well get into the hardest one, Elliot, won't we? Joe Calzaghe, Andre Ward. The thought of that is mesmerising. It's a difficult one because Joe Calzaghe was a very, very busy fighter. He threw a lot of shots, but Andre Ward knew how to neutralise that at times. And, you know, if you look back at when he fought Carl Froch, he knew when to hit Froch, clinch, and not let him do his best work inside or throw power punches. So I think it might have been one of those fights, Elliot, where it might have took Joe Calzaghe 3 or 4 rounds to wake up, because I think he might have been outboxed quite badly early on, because Joe Calzaghe was notorious for not being a fast starter. Look at Byron Mitchell. I don't know if you recall that fight. Byron Mitchell put Joe Calzaghe down, and I think it was the 2nd round, and Joe Calzaghe got up and stopped him in the same round, and he looked dreadful before Byron Mitchell put him down. So I think early on you would have to give it to Andre Ward, and I think if rest in peace Enzo Calzaghe, if he was here, I think he would have read Joe the Riot Act in the corner, maybe around about 3 or 4, and then I think it would have just been an absolute firefight, lots of shots traded, and yeah, I think we would have seen that one go in the distance for sure.
No, definitely good. Good stuff. I think. Do you think that Joe Calzaghe? Do you think at any point he would have put Andre Ward in serious trouble due to the amount of shots he had thrown, or do you think Andre Ward would have been able to sustain the quality of his defense throughout 12 rounds? And I don't want to say kept him off, but being able to not get hurt throughout the 12 rounds. Do you think that would have happened, or do you think that Calzaghe could have done what Sergey Kovalev did in his fights with Andre Ward and actually hurt him?
Yeah, good question, Elliot. I think that it is a difficult one, because if people are really honest with themselves, and I mean really honest, a lot of people thought Jeff Lacey was going to come over here and kill Joe Calzaghe, like really put it on him and stop him, get the stoppage, and they probably didn't think that Joe Calzaghe was capable of hurting Jeff Lacey. Now, we're not comparing Jeff Lacey and Andre Ward here, but make no mistake, Elliot, Jeff Lacey was very, very high regarded. Everyone thought he was going to take over that super middleweight division at the time. So I think Joe Calzaghe could have hurt Andre Ward. I think it would have took something a little bit special to hurt him. I think it would have needed to be late on, maybe 8 or 9, if Joe Calzaghe was playing catch-up and he threw maybe an 8 or 9 punch combination. But I don't think it's impossible for any fighter to get hurt. And I think that Joe Calzaghe could have hurt him. I would just say, based on their styles, it was maybe unlikely. I think it's a distance fight.
Good stuff. So after all that, we're going to move on to a second fighter in a bit. But in your heart of hearts, in your gut, with your gut feeling, who would you have lent towards for that fight?
I really didn't want you to ask me that.
Tricky one.
It's so hard, isn't it? It's so hard. I have to be honest. I think Joe Calzaghe would have just outworked him. I think Joe Calzaghe would have picked up rounds through volume of punches. If you look at the amount of punches that Andre Ward threw in rounds, and you look at the punches that Joe Calzaghe, I think Joe Calzaghe threw over 1,000 punches when he beat Jeff Lacey. I don't think Andre Ward would have let Joe Calzaghe do that. But look at Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins was so tricky. He was very, very cute. And Joe Calzaghe managed to get to Bernard Hopkins and outpoint him, and he did. If anyone says that Bernard Hopkins won that fight, then they're lying. It was very close, but Joe Calzaghe definitely won it. So I think Joe Calzaghe would have just outworked him in a very close fight.
Well, appreciate giving a prediction. I feel like asking you to do a prediction for two fighters who both went undefeated for their entire careers is a bit of a difficult question to ask. It's like kind of saying like, who's better, like a prime Barcelona and a prime Brazil, who would have won? Like you just don't know. It would have been tricky. I feel like this is the trickiest video we've done out of these, by the way. I feel these are really tough fights to analyze.
Yes.
So moving on from Joe Calzaghe to another fighter called Canelo Alvarez, who I think most people will have heard of who are watching this video. Look, we all know what happened in his last fight, lost to Dimitri Bivol. We can kind of analyze that in another video, but he is still the super middleweight king. He's still won nearly every round against Callum Smith, who was the Ring Magazine champion, stopped Billy Joe Saunders, stopped Caleb Plant as well, and all those fighters were undefeated before he fought them. He's now facing Golovkin again in September at super middleweight. He's expected to win that fight. Again, it's a really tricky one. And one thing that's tricky as well is that Canelo, as we know, has just kind of come up through the weights. And it's maybe debatable what his best weight is and where he's going to be for the next 5 years. And we don't know if he's reached his peak yet. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. So it's maybe an even trickier fight to analyze than Joe Calzaghe. But I'm going to hand things over to you now to say what you want to say about a potential fight between Andre Ward and Canelo Alvarez at 168.
Yeah. Do you know something, Elliot? I think out of the fights that we're going to talk about, I think this would have been the biggest fight.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the best, but the biggest. Can you imagine staying up on a Saturday night, 4 o'clock in the morning, and you're just about to watch Andre Ward Canelo? I don't even want to say things that does to you. It's just unbelievable. But I think it would have been a great clash of styles. Andre Ward, very, very clever fighter. I don't think Canelo is given anywhere near enough credit for his boxing IQ and his brain. And listen, a little bit off topic, Elliot, but let's get one thing right. Canelo Alvarez is 2 fights away from being a pound for pound king again, and there's no disgrace. And do you know something? I'm going to go out now and I'll give you a prediction. See, in the rematch, he beats Dimitri Bivol. How's that? I'll tell you that right now. He beats him. Yeah. Okay. But getting back on topic, I felt passionate about that there, but I think it'd be a very, very good fight, a great clash of styles. Both guys wait. They're kind of like, Canelo's more of an aggressive counter puncher. He'll walk forward and wait for you to commit and then throw a few shots. Andre Ward was more hit and grab and move angles. So I think it would have been a great matchup of styles, and I think that's one that might go all the way as well, if I'm being honest.
Good stuff. No, I think that out of all the fights we're going to discuss, in terms of the most entertaining fight,
yeah,
I'd lean towards that one. But yeah, again, it's a real tricky one. You mentioned there, like, you think it would have gone the distance. Is there not even like necessarily like a prediction, but how would Andre Ward have beaten Canelo, do you think? What do you think his, like, we all know what his style was like, but what do you think his game plan would have been? Because Canelo at 168 almost looks invincible. Obviously, we know he lost at 175, but I just can't imagine him losing to at 168, to be honest. Against I don't think anyone comes close to beating him at 168 personally. So how do you think Andre Ward would have gone about that fight?
I think that if you look at Canelo seems to struggle a little bit with guys who've got really good boxing IQ. Some of the people who don't get credit for their boxing IQ is even guys like GGG. Yes, he punches very hard. See, if you watch some of the things that Golovkin does in the ring, they're so clever. In the first fight, I had Golovkin just pipping Canelo. If you look at Bivol's tactics were perfect in the first fight. Canelo wasn't himself. He didn't even look remotely himself. But if we look, Canelo seems to come up short against very clever counter-punchers. Erislandy Lara gave him fits at times. Dimitri Bivol, Golovkin, fair enough, he's not necessarily a counter-puncher, but his boxing IQ and the amount of amateur fights he had speaks for itself. So I think the way to beat Canelo is to really intelligently box him on the back foot, and I think Andre Ward could have been a master at that. So yeah, I think that's where the weakness lies.
Good stuff. And finally, again, all bad doing this, but which way, not necessarily like a stone cold prediction, but is there a way that you're like leaning towards in this fight? If I said here's £10, you have to put on Andre Ward or Canelo, what are you doing? What are you going to
do? You guys at ESPN are absolutely my two favourite fighters currently are Golovkin and Canelo. I love both of them, love Canelo. I just think Andre Ward would have been a bit too cute for him. I think he would have just outpointed him at super middleweight. I think that it would have been a frustrating fight. I think he would have hurt Canelo, held him. Canelo wouldn't have been able to get into a rhythm. I just think my £10 would have been on Andre Ward that night on points.
Good stuff. Cool. But your reputation on the line here. But yeah, as you mentioned, we'll never know what would happen, which is frustrating. Yeah. Final fight. We've gone for a British fighter here. I think could have spoken about Chris Eubank Senior. Could have spoken about the James DeGales, the George Groveses. To kind of touch on different eras here, but fight we've agreed to discuss is Nigel Benn, two-weight world champion, the Dark Destroyer, extremely popular. Had a fantastic career. Lost a few fights, lost a couple towards the end of his career, but not really my generation. But it's someone who, if I could go back in time and watch the Nigel Benn fight, that would have been fantastic. Obviously, especially those fights, the iconic fights he had against Chris Eubank Senior. Same as the other two, mate. I think it's great that we're including a British fighter here, because I think we all love it when British fighters go abroad to the States and try and kind of dare to be great, as the saying says. How would Nigel Benn have gone up against Andre Ward, do you think?
He would have had to. So the great thing about Nigel Benn is I've watched quite a lot of Nigel Benn's fights. Unfortunately, I almost am that generation. Maybe I was a bit young, but I think Nigel Benn and he's, I'm taking a gamble here. I think maybe early to mid 90s, maybe early 90s was Nigel Benn's peak. Don't quote me on that, but obviously I watched him fighting guys like Doug DeWitt, Jerry McClellan, Chris Eubank, Senior, Collins. I watched a lot of his career. I think it would have been, I think Nigel Benn would have needed to come out and hurt Andre Ward early. And we've seen that Kovalev done that. And Nigel Benn is one of these guys, for example, when he fought Jerry McClellan, it's a tough fight to touch on because of how the end went, Elliot, but Jerry McClellan was expected to do a real job on Nigel Benn that night and early as well. So you could never count Nigel Benn out, but it would have been one of these ones where it was the power puncher against the counter puncher, and those make for tremendous fights because see if the counter puncher doesn't get it right, they're on their back. So yeah, I think it would have been a game of cat and mouse all night, and something would have had to give. If I was going to be honest with you, I'll leave you a teaser on this one. This is the only fight of the three that I think there would have been a stoppage in.
And do you think, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but do you think that the only way Nigel Benn could have won would have been by stoppage?
Yes.
Yeah, fair enough.
Good boxing ability, Elliot, very good boxing ability. He done everything, they've done the basics really well, but Nigel Benn was a puncher. Let's not dance around it. That's what he was known for. He put people to sleep. So yeah, I think if he was going to win, it would have had to be via knockout.
Yeah, no, good stuff. It's I don't know, I've gotten kind of excited here, but it's just such an anticlimax because it feels almost like we're doing a fight preview, but we're not. It's interesting to then put these fights out to the public and say, we'll put some Twitter polls out and say, right, what would have happened and make a bigger deal out of it. No, I think, I know we've discussed those three fights there. Is there anyone else that springs to mind that you think, right, that they would have given Andre Ward trouble? Remembering that Andre Ward kind of had time as a middleweight as well, but I feel like his peak was at super middleweight. Is there anyone else like British or non-British that you look at and think that guy gives Andre Ward serious problems?
Yeah, Roy Jones and James Toney, big time. Yeah. Two guys that were awesome, man. So I think we could have mentioned them too, but I just think a lot of people would. There's fights that they would have maybe loved to have seen more, like a guy like Nigel Benn who can put you to sleep with one shot, up against a counter puncher like Andre Ward. But I think if there was other ones that I want to touch point on, I think it would have been James Toney and Roy Jones Jr. for sure.
Yeah, good stuff. Cool. Well, I'm sure we could kind of go on all night talking about other potential fights, but Andre Ward is retired. I think he's going to stay retired. It's actually, at the time of recording, tomorrow is the 5-year anniversary of his last fight against Kovalev. So that's how long he's actually been retired for a decent amount of time now. I think from what I see on when he does his punditry and social media, I think he looks to me like he still stays in shape, and obviously he retired when he was 32, 33, I think, which was a surprise to some people. But he looked so difficult to beat to me. And I think it's also nice when someone retires youngish rather than fighting into their 30s too much. But yeah, I think final question from me to you, Greg, is: do you have a standout Andre Ward performance? Is there a fight you look at during his career and think he looked effing amazing that night? That was his possibly best performance. Is there one fight that signals out to you?
Yeah, there's actually a few, Elliot. I thought he looked amazing when he beat Kessler. I've never seen Kessler neutralised so much ever. Nobody was able to do that at Kessler. Even Joe Calzaghe had big trouble with Kessler for 4-5 rounds. Froch, although he was down, he kept Andre Ward going all night, and Andre Ward done really well to neutralise Carl Froch that night. But so many fights that I'm probably going to miss out. But for me, it's the second Kovalev fight, his last fight, because there were so many question marks over the first fight. A lot of people had Kovalev winning. He had put Andre Ward down. The second fight was like a proper job, like, and he stopped Kovalev as well. And he wasn't scared. He took Kovalev's power. So I think he went out on the best fight, the best performance of his career. Really, I really do. I think it was the second Sergey Kovalev fight.
Yeah, there was a lot on the line that night for sure. On that note, we'll stop things there. Greg, thank you for joining me. Really enjoyed it. It's been a great chat. Yeah, and it's been great to kind of touch on the career of Andre Ward and talk about some potential fights. But yeah, really enjoyed it, and we will be back next month for another video on a fighter that we will select. But yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Elliot. Really appreciate it.